believe we can start this session. If everybody can hear me, hello everyone. Welcome to this workshop on DNS and DOH. My name is Shane Hermoso from APNIC, and I'll be the moderator for this session. Now, having worked with DNS for quite a long time, this topic is actually something that I'm very interested and curious about, as I hope many of you are as well. So to help us understand the topic further, we have 4 expert panelists in the room, or virtual room for some of us, I suppose. We have Adiel Aklogan from ICANN, Jeff Houston from APNIC, Nai Wen Chu from TWNIC, and Fan Che Lin from Chunghwa Telecom. So 2 of our speakers will be providing us with technical background on DNS and DNS privacy. And then we have a couple of implementation case studies from 2 other speakers as well, which I'm sure you will be interested to hear. Now, just a quick reminder that questions will be entertained after each talk. Since we have a hybrid format, for those of you who are joined in person, you are very welcome to ask via the microphone provided at the venue. And for all our online guests, please add your questions on the chat and we will read them to our speakers. We have also allocated about 15 minutes towards the end of the session for Q&A for all of our panelists. So with that, I suppose, it's best that we get started now. I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Adiel Aklogan is the Vice President for Technical Engagement at ICANN. You've heard him speak in the previous session. We also, of course, know him in the community as the former President and CEO of AFRINIC. So he brings with him a wealth of knowledge about DNS and addressing. So he will talk about DNS and the role of ICANN. Over to you, Adiel.
Thank you very much, Shan. I have slides, so if I can have, I don't know if I can share. Oh, okay, well, it's already there. So I'm going to quickly take you through DOH and what is ICANN position on DOH and how we are saying. Don't know if you are seeing quickly to remind how the DNS usually work. We have each of us device has iOS, and those iOS have in them the stub resolver, which we call every time we want to do a translation between a name and an IP address. The stub resolver will talk to the recursive server that is set up on our device, either provided by our internal IT department or by our ISP, or sometimes even you use a public recursive server that will do the recursion and find the name or the matching that we are looking for. All those transactions represented by the arrow on this graphic are unencrypted. So they are in plain text. Anyone observing the transaction can see the request and the response that is provided by the recursive server to the stub, or even from the authoritative to the recursive server. What we are going to talk about today about DNS encryption is what is happening between the stub and the recursive resolver. And with a little bit tweak whereby the stub, instead of being operated from the iOS of the device, move a little bit up to the application level. But let's go a little bit in detail of that. As I showed before, the encryption of the DNS, as we talk about it today, starts at the stub and ends at the resolver level. In the classic setup of DNS, as we use it today, it's the application will call the stub, and the stub appear mainly in the iOS. Now, what is changing is that browser or application that act like browser start adding the function of stub resolver internally, so that you don't need to call the iOS anymore to start your resolution. Two standards are of interest in this, DNS over TLS and DNS over HTTPS. Both standards are valid standard through the IETF process. DOT is defined in RFC 7858 and DOH in 8484. Both protocols work for the same purpose, which means encrypting interaction between stub and recursive resolver. But there are some difference in the way they do the encryption and what are the channel they use for the encryption. And from network operation perspective as well, that is clearly translated. So instead of for DOH specifically, as that is the title of this session, I'm going to focus on that. For DOH particularly, instead of using the normal DNS resolution which rely on the stub resolver of the device, the application operator will rather incorporate DNS resolution into an HTTPS stream and initiate it from the browser and send it to a resolver. Basically, the stub resolver will start the HTTPS session, like if you are browsing a website, with not your web server, but with a DOH resolver in this time. And when the session is established, it will start sending normal DNS traffic or query through that secure channel that is established through HTTPS. When that is done, nobody can listen to the traffic anymore. The query are embedded into the HTTPS packets and intermingle with the regular web traffic. So the small difference between this DOH and DOT in terms of networking, for instance, is that DOT operate on a very specific port, so you can still filter that traffic by filtering the port. While for DOH, this is embedded in the web traffic. So if you cut the web traffic, the HTTPS traffic, you are cutting access to the web in general. Something that has raised a lot of eyebrow at the very early implementation of DOH is that sometimes browser rely on a pre-configured DOH resolver that is run by a third party. That means it removes the control from the user on which DOH server they can use. That is kind of another level of exfiltration of the resolution. This has been solved through different evolution or extension to the protocol to allow ISP to take a little bit more control over how DOH service is provided. Of course, DOH and DOT have raised both of them eyebrow in the technical community and other part of the global community, of course. From ICANN perspective, at the very early of the protocol, we have released Octo 003, which is a document that actually explain a little bit the notion of filtering, monitoring the DNS, and also raise some policy implication. The most important thing to say about that document is that it raised the concern but does not address them, basically. The objective being here to allow the community to understand what exactly DOH is about and what are the questions that it may raise from the policy perspective, and explain ICANN position as organization in that area. So circumventing the DNS filtering for security purpose. What do we mean there? In general, when you run network, you put some filter in place to protect user and your network. This could be for to avoid or mitigate malware that can be that can use your DNS traffic, preventing user to inadvertently communicate with malware server when they are infected, or actually monitoring exfiltration of sensitive data from within an organization infrastructure. Other filtering that are also implemented at the DNS level are for content. If you are a parent, you may have this kind of setup at your house to prevent your kid to access some malicious website or some content that are, offensive or so on. This can also be mandated through, government legislation. You can also track what website, what online services your the people using your network are using, and so on. But when you start using encrypted DNS and DOH particularly, you start circumventing those filters, and you start, bypassing those filter implemented through different kind of policy. Either it's network management policy or it's just content access policy. So as soon as you do that, the data is not available for the filtering anymore. So of course you bypass it, which can be problematic. So it is a new standard. It is out there and it's being implemented already in a few applications and browser out there. Usually the question that we are asked is what is ICANN position, and is ICANN endorsing or promoting DNS or encrypted DNS. We're talking about the stop to resolve a site today. Our position is a very neutral in general. This is a technology, and this is a technology that addresses specifically privacy, user privacy. And in that regard, ICANN has a very neutral position on the DOH implementation or deployment by user or in organization in general. What though we say is that privacy in general is something good. I mean, having more control over anyone's privacy online is good. DNS data in general should be protected when there is a risk for them to put the stability of the service at risk. As we have seen, filtering of DNS query of filtering the DNS traffic can be beneficial in several occasions. It's also generally by principle difficult for your OS or network application to have enough information for controlled decision or enforce any safety or legal mandate and so on. So it poses some problem that either the community of anyone or anyone implemented this technology should take into consideration while doing that. So that's briefly what I want to say about DOH in my introduction. We'll be happy to participate to the discussion and contribute to the other question that may come in the follow-up presentation. I'm sure we are going to talk more actively about case of implementation and what is being observed today since those two protocols have become standard. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Adel. That's a very good introduction on encrypted DNS and DNS over HTTPS in general. I think it also kind of like sums up ICANN's role and position very nicely. So it's a good starting point for our following discussion. I think we have time to entertain one question from the from the floor, if there is any. If not, I'll reserve my question at the end, perhaps, so we can proceed with the next presenter. All right, so our next speaker will have an implementation case study. Our next speaker is Nai-Wen Xu from TWNIC. He is the Director of Department of Technology at TWNIC, and his talk will be a case study about DOH implementation with Quad 101. So passing it over to you, Nai-Wen, please tell us more about Quad 101.
Okay, good afternoon. This is Nai-Wen Xu from TWNIC. Now we are talking about TWNIC DOH experience on Quad 101. Okay, this is the content today will present to you. First, I will talking about the Quad 101 current status, and who is use the Quad 101 and the Quad DOH status and some conclusion. Okay, Quad 101 is a project we TWNIC cooperate with APNIC. APNIC provides the IP address and the TWNIC operates the DNS server. Currently, there are 7,000 to 12,000 queries per second every day, and the growth rate you can see the chart. Almost 1%, 100%. Every year, the traffic will double. Okay, this is the current user from which country to use the Quad 101 service. You can see the most major users come from Taiwan. Okay, at the beginning of the Quad 101 launch service, they are almost more than 80% users come from Taiwan. But now Taiwan use only 56%, and the second is US, and the United States, and the third is VN. VN, since we launched the Quad 101, is in the list in the top 5, always in the top 5. Okay. The TWNIC launched DOH service on Quad 101 after the DOH RFC published as RFC. We launched the service 2018. At the beginning, only 300 concurrent DOH connection. Because the DOH is over the HTTPS, it is TCP connection. DOH for reducing the overhead, so you always keep the connection established, unless you do not do the DNS query for maybe 30 seconds or 1 minute, then no traffic, then will drop the connection. So we can count the connection, then we can know how many users use our service. So at the beginning only 300, and last year suddenly from about 300 jumped to 2,000, and the growth to now is 4,000 concurrent connections. Okay, the DOH is about 7% of the whole Quad 101 DNS query, 7%, and the DOT is 13%. So you can see in Quad 101, the increased DNS query is about 20%. It's very high, I think. Okay. We can see the major user to use our Quad 101 DOH service from CNN. You can You can see there are two pie charts on the screen. The hand side, the URL DNS.table slash DNS query is our official DOH service URL. But the right hand side, this is our web page. But at the end of our last year, we found there are many connections to our web server, the Core 101 web server, and about more than 100 queries per second. It's very fast, and every package is very small. At first, we do not know is the DOH query, and we found there are some user teach the user post some user guides on some forum or some discussion groups, say how to use the dynamic DOH service, but the DOH URL do something wrong. So many users set the wrong DOH URL. So finally, we added the DOH service on the web page service. So if you use browser to visit the Core 101 web page, you will see the web page. And if you use DOH, we also provide a DOH service. So either the correct or incorrect DOH URL, the CN is the major user. Okay, you can see the DOH almost from China. They are 97% of our DOT user is from China. Okay, next slide I will show you the usage, CPU usage of our DOT and the DOH and the traditional DNS. The traditional DNS is about 80% query, but you only use the 65% CPU usage. And the DOH is 80%, DOT 70%. Okay. This is my conclusion. The increased DNS is not only for privacy, or it can use for bypass square firewall of China, because you can see currently the Core 101 major user is from DOH user is from China. Since the last year, the China users grows very fast, and the DOH consumes more resources. Yes, we know, but it's not as much as we expect. Okay. This is my present. Any questions?
Okay, are there any questions for Naiwen? Right, I don't see any so far. Thank you, Naiwen. Very pleased to really hear about the efforts behind the deployment project. Thank you very much for sharing your experience. And it's really good to see a consistent growth in the number of queries. 7% share of DNS traffic in such a short time is actually really good. So well done to you and your team. We will have more time for questions for Naiwen and the rest of the speakers at the end. So for now, let's proceed with our third speaker. So moving on, our next speaker is APNIC's very own Chief Scientist. Jeff Houston is, of course, a very well-known figure in our community and an internet pioneer in Australia. So he has done an expansive research work on DNS and DNS security, as well as other internet technologies. So to tell us more about DNS Oblivion, here's Jeff Houston. Over to you.
Thanks a lot for that, Shane, and good afternoon all. It's really a pleasure to join you here this afternoon. Hopefully you're seeing my slides and hopefully they're advancing, are they? Yes?
They are, yes.
I'll press on. I actually wanted to go into a little background around what we're trying to do with the DNS and why the DNS is so important in this increasing sensitivity to eavesdropping. Because you see, the DNS is remarkably easy to tap and tamper. The queries are open, they're unencrypted, payloads aren't secure. You can't even detect when tampering happens. And quite frankly, they're very predictable. So if you're going to play with something, the DNS is an absolutely obvious target. And the other thing is, nobody knows where their DNS queries go. I have a query, it's a domain name, my browser goes somewhere. Isn't this cool? What actually happens with your DNS query? Who answered it? Where did the query go? What information was exposed? Nobody knows. And so when tampering happens, it's almost invisible. No one can see it. And why is the DNS really, really important? Because everything you do starts with a query to the DNS. So if I saw your DNS log, I know you. I know what you do. I know everywhere you go online. I know your interests. I know your activities. I know where you bank. I know you. And so in some ways, in this world that we live in, the internet surveillance economy, the DNS is crucial. And so many folk have so much of an interest in the DNS. This is uncomfortable. Now, a lot of folk would like it to stop. After the Snowden revelations in the United States, it's certainly surveillance is big business, both corporate and government. And a lot of folk feel very uncomfortable about that. Can we stop it? Can we make it harder to do it? We can't stop. We won't stop it. Can we make it harder? Maybe. And that's what I want to talk about. Now, in some ways, trying to make the DNS a secret is actually really quite difficult. I'm like, is the label I'm querying meant to be a secret? Is www.apnic.net a secret? Of course not. Is the response a secret? Well, no, it's just an IP address. So what's the issue? If it's not the query and it's not the answer, it's actually me. The fact that I asked for that name and got that answer. And while www.apnic.net might be relatively benign, there are certain domain names that trigger a lot of interest out there because of the connotations of the association of going to those sites and what that means, what the profile means. So it's the combination of who you are and what you're querying for, which we're trying to stop. So I'll go back and repeat Adiel's slide in a slightly different way to actually look at how the DNS works. A lot of folk thinks it works like this. Client resolver server. Yeah, easy. No, it's not. Because inside the DNS is this huge mess of machinery. DNS server farms, DNS resolver farms, Anycast, query logs, query redirection, forwarders, and so on. It's horrendously complicated. And oddly enough, almost every part of that whole DNS fabric can be corrupted. All the way from the corrupted host to wireline and interception, resolvers that trap queries, servers that leak queries. It happens everywhere. So far that now secondhand DNS queries are a business opportunity, like Farsight. And they're not the only folk doing this, that actually take DNS queries, other people's queries, and convert it into a business intelligence platform. Very common these days. So how can we improve it? What steps are we doing? And that's what I want to talk very quickly about with you today. What are we doing about this? One of the early steps was to stop the DNS being so chatty. Because every time I wanted to go to www.apnic.net, I kind of broadcast to the world the full domain name. You don't need to do that. You don't need to tell the root servers the full domain name. You don't need to tell the .NET servers the full domain name. You can actually restrict the query name. And these days, a lot of recursive resolvers are doing query name minimization, but not stubs, only recursives. So while it's a really good idea, all it does is sort of move the inner part of the DNS, recursive to authoritative, and sort of seals that up a bit. But for you and I as end users, yeah, nothing changes. So sounds good, doesn't move the needle. Whoops. How about DNSSEC? You know, signing things. Signing's great. You know, a little bit of pixie dust. Crypto always works, right? And the whole idea is I sign my domain name, and every time you want an answer from my zone, I will send you both the answer and a digital signature. You can validate the authenticity of the answer. Sounds terrific. A lot of recursive resolvers now do DNSSEC validation, and they won't send back an answer to the stub if the answer doesn't validate. So if someone's tampering with the DNS, you don't get the answer. Sounds great. But if the recursive resolver is doing DNSSEC validation, that's great, but the stub, the end user, isn't protected. And a huge amount of DNS interception, malware, tampering happens on that last mile link from the recursive resolver through to the stub. And if that's not protected, you're not protected. And so again, it's kind of yes, but. So why don't we all do DNSSEC validation in the stubs? I don't know if you've tried, but if you have, you'll realize it's really, 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 really slow. People don't live that long. So great idea, but taking a long time to actually make it fast enough to be useful. And that's why, although a fair deal of the world does validation, very few folk actually sign their domain names because it just makes things slow. So how else can we do this? How do we pick up that link at the edge between the stub and the recursive? How do we make that better? Well, this sort of refers where Adiel was. The first one was actually saying, well, let's use what the web does, because we've done a huge amount of work in making the web more secure by using transport layer security, TLS. And all it is an overlay over TCP, where you use, if you will, a TCP connection, but you then negotiate a session key, and that everything between you and the party you're talking to is encrypted with a one-off session key. Sounds brilliant. It has a second thing too. Because we do authentication, I can only speak to the right party, the party that can say, here's who I am, and I can prove it. And so being misled is a lot harder with TLS. Sounds brilliant. Let's use it for the DNS. Well, let's think about that a bit. When the IETF standardized it, they used TCP port 853. Now, these days, there's a lot of malware out there, and a lot of folk use security firewalls that block everything except port 443, port 53, and that's about it. And so when you try and use a new port, a lot of folk won't let the traffic through. And using the TCP port 853, unless you explicitly configure permission, it isn't going to work. TCP is a lot of overhead. TLS is a lot of overhead. The recursive resolver is going to have to work a lot harder. Someone has to pay for that. You're not paying. Who's paying? And quite frankly, this is all relative. If I do a DOT session to your resolver, then you still know everything about me. Other folk might not know, but you do. And so in some ways, it's a relative improvement. Better, but not brilliant. We took it one step further, we always can, and instead of using the straight transport, we pushed it into HTTPS framing. So now we're actually using DNS over TLS with HTTP object semantics. Well, fair enough. But the other thing was, all of a sudden we're using port 443. It's very hard to block port 443 because that's what the internet is these days. And if you happen to be using TLS 1.3 and using encrypted client hello, so no one can tell whom you're talking to, then this starts to look relatively robust. Yeah, of a sort. So that's not a bad idea, but that's an awful lot of work. So the reason why you prefer to use this, port 443 is better supported, and quite frankly, applications can do this, not just the host platform. So in some ways, applications can say, I'm sick and tired of waiting for Apple to update iOS. I'm sick and tired of waiting for Google to update Android. I'm sick and tired of waiting for Samsung to update their version of Android, etc. The application can just go, look, no problem. I'll handle it myself. I'll just do the DNS over HTTPS the same way as I do everything else over HTTPS. So applications are moving away from the platform. Interesting. So still, it's a marginal improvement. Along comes Quick. Now, Quick is originally developed by Google, and it was originally part of an effort to make the DNS faster, to make the web faster, but you can use it for the DNS as well. And what it does is use a thin UDP shim layer and then encrypt everything, including TCP control. And we can do this with the DNS as well, which is starting to really push things into, if you will, a better place for that all-important stub to recursive. So can this work? Well, it's actually hard to see what I'm doing as long as I trust Google or Cloudflare or Quad9. I have to trust somebody, and that's uncomfortable. In fact, it's worse than uncomfortable. That's bad. I'm sharing all my secrets with Google or Cloudflare or whatever, but I didn't pay Google. I have no contract with Google. I'm not even sure if Google obeys the laws of Australia where I live. And if it's American laws, then I'm an alien. I have no protection. So how am I protected? Is sharing all my secrets with Google a good idea or about as bad as it ever was? Is this an improvement or not? Got to make it better. Now, as I said right at the outset, the real issue is who I am and what I'm asking for. That pairing is really the important thing. Can we break that? Well, this was a really good research paper, and Oblivious DNS actually is a very clever use of encryption that actually allows you to make queries where no one can actually associate me with the queries I make. The way it works is overloading the query name itself. So this is standard DNS, but instead of putting the query name in open ASCII in the DNS payload, I encrypt it inside the DNS. So I'm actually asking for a rather bizarre name that no one else can decrypt except a very special server out there. So I encrypt it using the key of a well-known Oblivious DNS server and then just send it through the normal DNS. The recursive resolver picks it up and sends it off to the authoritative server, the Oblivious DNS server. But at this point, that Oblivious DNS server now has the public key, the private key, that can decrypt that query. And it then turns into a recursive and makes the query. But it doesn't know who I am. All it knows is some recursive resolver has passed it a query. The recursive resolver didn't forward my identity. So the Oblivious DNS server knows the query, but not who I am. The recursive resolver knows me, but not what I'm asking for. So the answer comes back, it gets encrypted and sent back through, and so only I am privy to who I am and what I asked for, no one else. Brilliant idea, but it's still DNS over UDP over port 53. It's still open in that respect. But the real issue is you're trying to put an awful lot of data in the query name field, and that doesn't work. Now, Cloudflare and a few others then looked at this and said, well, maybe we can do it using the tricks used in Tor. Instead of trying to encrypt the query name, why don't we just do a double TLS wrapping, TLS in TLS? And so now we introduce two new things, a proxy and a target. So what I do as the client is I generate a session key and I encrypt the DNS query against the key of the target. So far, so good. But then I find and select a proxy and encrypt all that with the key of the proxy and send it to the proxy. The proxy now unwraps itself. It knows it's a query, finds the target, and sends the query to the target, which can then take the full internal query and so on. No one knows my identity and the query in this as long as the proxy and the target never ever collude. So good idea, but it relies on two parties who I don't know, who I never expect to know, not colluding. And I can't tell if they do or not. But, you know, good idea. Will it take till effect? Is this mainstream technology? No. All of these efforts are academic. I don't think they're going to change the dial much. Why? Because we don't pay for the DNS. Who pays for Quad 101? If I make a query to it, I don't pay. So Quad 101 is kind of very nice and so on, but it's sort of a service for free. And the problem with any service for free is the more it gets used, the higher the cost, but no one's paying for those costs. So you get into success disaster problems. And the DNS is a success disaster. There is no DNS economy for name resolution. It's an economic wasteland. The only folk who foot the bill are ISPs on the whole. 70% of all end clients use the ISP's resolver. But for the ISP, DNS is cost, not revenue. And to make all these new things like DOH, TLS, DOQ, oblivious DNS is all cost. It's not revenue. And so the DNS is actually highly resistant to these kinds of changes. This will take decades, if it ever happens at all, because no one's paying. And because no one pays, no one's in a hurry to spend money. So my opinion, people don't change the dials very much. The defaults won't change. The DNS, open, unencrypted, port 53, for all of its problems, is likely to be the mainstream for the mainstream DNS. But applications don't want to share that fate. The world of Chrome, the world of browsers, the world of Firefox don't want to share that fate. They are sick and tired of waiting for everyone else to get there. They're acutely aware of the privacy issues and they're way more agile. These are the folk that brought you quick because they were tired of waiting for platforms to change transport. And these are the folk that are doing DNS over HTTPS because they're tired of waiting for everyone else. And the application ecosystem is actually divorcing itself from the internet. And not only are they taking name resolution technology with them, they're taking the namespace. And the life that we see coming down the line is actually an evolution from network-centric services through platform-centric to application-centric. Applications are now taking their ball and moving elsewhere. I don't believe it is possible in that new world to maintain a single, unified, coherent namespace. It's going to fragment, it's going to split. And the entire internet service domain as a cohesive network is going to break with it, because applications don't want to wait for decades for everyone else to catch up. They're just going to go to where they want to go and say, well, we don't need the rest of you, thank you. And I suspect for the internet, that's not actually the best of all possible answers. I think it's actually a really lousy answer. But again, I think the economics and the technology are inexorably driving us to there. Thank you. If there are any questions, I will happily try and answer them or leave it to the end. So over to you, Shane.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That's very well explained. It did clarify a lot of concepts on DNS privacy, right? There's a few things actually to digest there for those who are not familiar. You have DO53, DOQ, DOH, DOT, and on top of that, you have oblivious DNS. I believe for many of the folks in this session, ODNS is still a very new concept. So if anyone has questions for Jeff, here's your chance. We are a bit ahead of time, so we can entertain questions. Also, just a quick note, by the way, for some of you who are having issues with viewing the slides, they will be available later at the event website. So if you are not following the slides, you can check it out later as well. Any questions for Jeff? None so far. I guess we'll leave it at the end at the Q&A. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
All right. Now, next is our last, of course, not the least speaker. We have Fan Che Lin, who is an engineer at Chunghwa Telecom. He is heavily involved in the development and operation of one of Taiwan's most popular DNS resolvers. So here is Fan Jielin to discuss their experience with DOH implementation.
Hello, everyone. This is Fan Jielin. You can also call me Jason. And I'm really glad to be here. Oh, I have to do it myself. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Okay. This presentation is also arranged in chronological order. So firstly, I'm going to summarize what we considered during preparation to provide DOH service. And then in the process section, I'm going to list what we did to make things work as expected. Then in the status quo section, I will share some observations and lessons learned. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the issues and concerns we have about DOH. Back in 2019, when we started working on DOH, we concluded that there should be 3 components we need to provide DOH service. The first one is obvious, which is resolver. After all, DNS query don't resolve themselves, so we need resolvers to do it. And we also need something to serve SSL certificate because it's HTTPS. And then we also need something to, and that very something also have to do HTTPS decoding. And then we also need something to do, to extract and make DNS queries that traditional DNS, which is the resolver I just mentioned, can handle. And of course, the reverse is necessary. We have to wrap the DNS response ultimately into the HTTPS response. And how do we implement? Firstly, we tried and assessed solutions in our lab and pick up the one of the most acceptable stability and maintainability. And meanwhile, we accumulated know-how for how to install and how to tune and how to maintain and how to troubleshoot the new configure and even the application. And as usual, we deployed all the setups in batches and to avoid one single problematic change to affect all the servers. Okay, and lastly, we enhance our monitor and adopt the DOH client script to perform periodical lookup to make sure things work as expected. And if there's anything abnormal, we will receive SMS message or emails. One thing I forgot to mention, we didn't build our DOH service from scratch. We used our existing resolvers and had our load balancer specially configured to handle 443 traffic. And about what we found include the things here. The first one is the traffic is low. And after all, we haven't seriously promoted our DOH service. And we're not in browser's DOH option. And there's not yet auto discovery mechanism. So, so the traffic is low so far compared to our traditional DNS service. And the second thing is that we learned that HTTP access doesn't equal to DNS query. And I know this may sound obvious or even stupid, but let me explain. Firstly, amount-wise, HTTPS access is much more than DNS queries. And the reason one of the reasons we thought of is that when you open a port, especially web ports on the internet, sooner or later you're going to be scanned, and such scan traffic are unlikely to be valid DOH queries. So that would make the DNS queries actually processed by the resolver backend is much less than what we actually receive. So the first thing we learned, the difference is in the amount. And of course, the content-wise or quality-wise or characteristic-wise, DOH works based on TCP, while the traditional DNS is based on UDP. So that's another big difference. So based on the fact and the nature of the new service, we think that in addition to QPS, session count is another very important quantitative indicator. Compared with the traditional DNS, QPS suffices as the main indicator, but in DOH case, session count must be watched. And so are the capability and performance that the appliances to process the sessions. Okay. So what do we have in mind? The first technical issue is about DDoS mitigation. Because of the very different characteristic of DLH traffic, we believe that the monitoring parameters and thresholds and even the defense works must be updated or even enhanced. So DDoS will be still be challenging while providing the service. And we also want to share some practical issues. Us and Resolver, we think we are in a little bit awkward position. And after all, DLH has been promoted as a weapon against sneaky ISP, which we're not, hopefully. And the other thing is that us and SP, we should not interfere with how end users or end clients use the service. So if they choose to use Quad 8, Google's Quad 8, or Quad 101, which is good, and we can force them back. And the second thing is that we also cannot force the browser providers to add us in as one of the DOH providers. So that makes us not very not many things that we can do as in the ISP. The only thing we can do is to have the service ready and keep it working. So to be honest, for now, our top priority will still be the traditional DNS service, and we consider DLH as a value-added service with which we explore the possibility of such a traditional DNS service, and also as a tool a way to confront the issue of centralization. Yeah, I think that's pretty much about what I have for now. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Franche, or should I just call you Jason? Very good to learn about your deployment experience. So thank you very much for that detailed setup. You showed us phases, you showed us the issues that you were facing and things like that. So thank you for sharing. So at this point, I guess I'll first thank all of our speakers for the wonderful talks and presentations and for keeping with the time. And at this point, I'd also like to now invite questions from the floor if there are any questions for our panelists. While we're waiting for others to ask questions, maybe I'll throw in some of my questions for now. We'll start with Adiel. I suppose you did mention that ICANN has a very neutral position and focuses more into the technology. But in what ways, I suppose, does ICANN work with the community on the topic of DNS privacy? I know, and I've read a couple of documents, at least from last year, related to encrypted DNS and its implications. And also, I think another document comparing DOH and DOT. So can you please let us know more about those efforts?
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. Although we have that neutral position in what we encourage people to do about encryption, as I mentioned, it's a decision for people who use it. We do monitor the evolution of the technology in that area. I mentioned in my presentation, unfortunately, and I'm sorry for that, my slide didn't work. I mentioned in my presentation Octo 003, which is a paper that we wrote on DNS encryption, and that raised certain question about DNS encryption, some policy questions on the implication and the circumventing some of the filtering or protection measure that set up on the DNS. So that allow us mainly to inform our community about those evolution, because it's part of our ICANN mission, so that the community can, if they need, start a discussion around policy implication of those evolution within ICANN remit, or be informed in the way they interact with their registrar or their DNS provider in such. So our main action right now is to monitor how this new DNS technology or additional layer to the DNS are being deployed, are being used, measuring the impact on the performance of the DNS as much as we can, and writing to inform the community about what we are seeing without having any judgmental or prescriptive position on them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for explaining that. Maybe for Naiwen, with regards to deployment and to some extent even Fanche, Jason already mentioned that they are not actively promoting DOH, and their focus is really on the traditional DNS resolver as it is. So for Naiwen, perhaps, are you actively engaging with potential users to switch on or to use the service?
Okay.
Or maybe does it require some education for them to understand the benefits of this technology for them?
Okay. Dynamic had write some document regarding to the DOT and the DOH on our web page. But currently, actually, not many Taiwan users use our service. Major user is from China. Currently, I see is the status. So I don't think because maybe if you notice our service, our DOH service, this week we move our DOH service from another ISP to current to our another ISP, because the bandwidth is not enough. Recently, the DOH traffic grows very fast. So, and so we if user wish to use the service, is very good. We will upgrade our hardware and provide the service. Yeah. But I don't think I don't know because this is service, just a service. This is not our Dynamic's core business. So we will do the best. But compared to the other ISP, for example, 从 Hotel.com 啊，或 some Google or Google their service. Our core 111 service is very small compared to the other service. Yeah. So I don't think we will promote the service very hard. Yeah. Okay.
All right, thanks about Jason. Do you mind commenting as well?
Yeah, thank you for your question. As I said, for now we don't have a precise or really a plan to promote the new service, but we do realize the issue of especially the centralization, and which means most of the traffic, according to the trend we have, are very likely to be absorbed by the main, especially the browser provider and the cooperated providers. So in that case, from the market shares view, we also worry that our user might be attracted there. So I think eventually we will have to work on how to persuade people, maybe not in the terms of using DOH, but in a way that they can still trust our service and use our service. That's what I have to know.
Very interesting. You did mention centralization, and as we all know, there's a growing number of third-party DOH providers, mostly from cloud providers. So was this ever like a concern or perhaps a consideration for deploying your own at the beginning when you were still planning it?
Oh, I learned.
For both Jason and Naiwen. Jason, you can continue.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, actually, I learned the term from some articles which talks about the current trend is mainly feature the browser and some public DNS's cooperation. So following the such trend, people might be directed to like Cloudflare or Google's Quad A because of the default setting of browsers. So in that case, we preview that because everyone uses browsers every day and even every moment. So so we preview the potential effect of such use habit or the situation. So that's why we centralization become one of the issues that we care very much.
Thanks for that, Jason. Adele has a question for Jeff, actually. So would you mind sharing it?
Oh yeah, Jeff, you mentioned something in your presentation that is something that some of us have philosophical thought about when we start talking about a DO star, which is the fact that application and platform are taking their stuff and going somewhere and providing the service that they need to increase trust to their user and so on, which will have a side effect of creating fragmentation in the namespace. That's specifically the area that I'm worried about. What do you think about that? And do you think it is too late for us to kind of scrap the whole complexity that we are adding to the DNS today and starting everything from scratch and on a blank page and redesigning this so that we can tackle the real problem, because it's a serious issue that was in between line in your presentation there.
So it's an interesting question. If you think of the number of devices that run DNS software, a snapshot of the planet today, you would probably view around 10, maybe 100 billion devices with bits of DNS software. And to contemplate changing the DNS at that scale is impossible. We don't know how to do it. We don't know how to pay for it. It's never going to happen. This is like the V4 to V6 transition, only worse, a lot worse. There's so much embedded and there's no money. And a number of folk are very, very frustrated with this. And the most frustrated of all of them happen to be the browser people, because they've spent a huge amount of effort making browsers faster and more secure. And the DNS is undermining everything. And so in the same way that Quick took transport protocols and took them off the platform and put them into user space, they're now taking the namespace off the platform and putting it into application space. But as soon as they do that, and names become an attribute of the browser or any old app, you don't have to obey the rules of DNS anymore. Because quite frankly, you're the money. It's your users and your application. And so why don't I provision special names for my application? And whether my application is Chrome or Firefox or, I don't know, Skype, why don't I just do it myself in my own space? And the answer is, why not? It's secure. It's very secure. No one else can see it happening. So that when I break the namespace and go off into my own private namespace, no one sees me doing it, but it's done. Now, you should be worried. We should all be worried, because over the last 10 years, because of the V4, V6 transition problem, we broke the address space. Addresses aren't unique. They don't span anymore. Everyone's behind a NAT. There is no coordinated address space anymore. Get over it. And what we relied on was a single cohesive namespace. And guess what? That's gone too. And so now we're creating application-specific internets that only dimly are aware of each other. And oddly enough, we're rebuilding the walls bit by bit, quite inevitably. And there is nothing stopping us from doing this. There's no break to this, because no one knows how to shift the internet's infrastructure anymore. It's just too big to change. And so people are breaking out, moving at their own speed, with their own money and their own momentum. This is the nightmare of fragmentation playing out right in front of you. And I don't see any other way of phrasing it. This is what we're living through.
Oh boy, thank you.
Yeah,
Jeff.
oh boy.
Thank you for ruining the rest of my night.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Adil and Jeff. We do have one question from, what's his name? Yoshiro Yunea. Yoshiro, if you can unmute your microphone and ask your question. Yes, we can hear you.
So I have a question to Jeff. If I run a resolver on my machine, does it consider as an oblivious DNS because it hides iterated queries from the full resolvers other than my machine, like public DNS?
Oblivious DNS, the way it's being trialed by Cloudflare, and there are a few others in partnership. PCCW is one of them, and there are a couple of others in the Cloudflare announcement, is actually really geek territory. You actually have to run your own very special stub resolver inside your platform that, a bit like Tor, does double level TLS, creates session keys, and does a whole bunch of work. This is not mainstream stuff. And quite frankly, the guarantees are really bad, because in so many ways, you don't know if the proxy and the actual oblivious target, you don't know if they're colluding. And if they collude, all of the advantage of separating identity from query go away, and you've lost it again. So I actually think this is playtime. I think it's a nice idea to play with, but I don't think it's what's going to happen. I think what we're going to run away from, and this is what I was talking with Adiel, is that oblivious DNS assumes you're still using the DNS. But if you think about DOH a lot and think about application level namespace, the most logical thing to do is for the application to carve out its own namespace and walk away from the DNS and use a DNS specific to that application. And guess what? That's what's going to happen. It's a whole lot easier. There's a whole lot less leakage of information. I can contain the entire space. It's relatively secure, but it's not the DNS anymore. And so I think our efforts to try and make the DNS secure have now failed to the extent that the DNS is now falling apart because folk just can't make it secure. And if folk want security, and the browser folks certainly do, and the app folks certainly do, then the only other way of doing this is to pull it out of the DNS because it's the DNS that's the problem. And I think that's the most inevitable. And more importantly, I think that's where the money is going. You know, the money is in app space. It's not in platforms. It's not in networking. It's not in infrastructure. The applications will go where they want to go because they can afford it. And so it's a rather bleak message, but nevertheless, I see it being a very logical message in terms of business, in terms of economics, and in terms of technology. So I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I think, you know, it's bad news.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Yoshiro and Jeff. I guess just a final question, if anyone wants to answer. I really like the slide from Jeff that asked, like, will any of the DNS privacy approaches become mainstream? So I guess the question would be, what do you think, anyone in the panel, what do you think will be the main driving force for adoption? Anyone?
In the silence, I will jump in.
Yeah. Yes, please, Jeff.
No one pays. Google do this for free. Cloudflare do it for free. And because no one pays, there's actually very little incentive. And that's the conundrum of the DNS. It's the last vestige of free. But the problem with free is no one's incented to invest. So we've developed all these great, expensive technologies. But no one can afford to run the DNS over TCP. It costs 3 times as much to service the same query load. 3 times as much. And if you add TLS, it costs around 4.5 times as much to service the same query load. And if no one's paying, all you're doing is increasing your bills, but not increasing your revenue. And so we can't break out of the fact that economically the DNS is a wasteland. And what that means is all these great ideas are fantastic ideas, but the DNS is not going to move. And that's why the application folk who are so frustrated with this, and you can see their frustration, you know, all of the HTTP folk are now crowding into the DNS room going, let's do this differently. Let's do it our way. Let's split the DNS up and we'll take our bit and walk away. And you know, that's the future that's playing out here. I wish it was something different, but I'm sorry, it's just not happening any other way.
All right, thank you very much for that.
I will add that, I mean, Jeff's message is bleak, of course, but we are going to live into a transition period where, you know, we will continue to be doing what we know. And I also think that those new open resolver service provider will try to find a business model that can allow them to provide or offer those innovation to their customer, and see how that drill them. But of course, as Jeff mentioned, we are in uncharted water here, and we have to continue doing what we do. promoting best practices, helping people to have a secure and stable DNS for now, but with knowing that this landscape is moving fast and moving into direction maybe that we may not have full control on.
Very well said. Thank you very much, everyone. I think these are very interesting discussions, but we have to end to make way for the next session. So thank you very much to our panelists and to everyone who's attended. We hope that you have taken something out, dispelled any misconception as well. Thank you, and this is the end of this session. Thank you, everyone.